Good afternoon, everybody. Emily Gallen here. Welcome to my mini task presentation. This is a little photo of me for those of you who don't know me, and I thought it would be fitting seeing as I took it when I was on vacation in Vancouver, and so it's at the Capilano Suspension Bridge, which I really liked. So, what am I going to be talking about today with you, lovely people? Well, behavior change principles G3 and G4. We're going to start off with G3, which is establish and use conditioned reinforcers. But first, what is a conditioned reinforcer? And if we want to get technical with it, it's a stimulus change that functions as a reinforcer because of prior pairing with one or more other reinforcers, sometimes called secondary or learned reinforcer. And you'll probably remember how to establish a conditioned reinforcer from Pavlov and his dog salivating. So if you look at this cute little photo here of this little pooch, we got him salivating to this nice, juicy little turkey, right? And that's before conditioning. So we have an unconditioned stimulus, the turkey, and an unconditioned response of the salivating from the dog. And also before conditioning, we're going to have another neutral stimulus put in there, the bell. The bell's not going to make the dog salivate. He's not going to have a conditioned response to that. But during conditioning, when we pair that unconditioned stimulus and that neutral stimulus, the bell and the juicy turkey together, we are going to have that salivation and that unconditioned response. After that conditioning is all done, we're going to have a conditioned stimulus. So that bell now is going to be a conditioned stimulus. And when it rings, it's going to make the dog salivate. And now the salivating is a conditioned response. Let's think of some examples and non-examples of conditioned reinforcers. Start off with the non-examples: air, heat, food to survive. These are primary reinforcers, so they are needed to survive and they don't even need to be conditioned to be reinforcing. All right, so that's why I have them in the non-example category. And then we have the examples. I have here money, tokens, and good grades. Money is a great example because we use it every day in our lives, right? It's a token economy as well, and we cash it in for backup reinforcers, food, shelter, whatever we find reinforcing, Patreon, Google movies, all those types of things. And we learn over time that these things are reinforcing, and it makes us more likely to try and get and earn more money, right? To buy those things. Children aren't even born with the knowledge of money or how it's even tied to things in their life that they love. So it's learned, right? It has to be conditioned. Tokens, I picked that one because a lot of us have already really used these. We've done token economies maybe with some of our clients, and we know that we have to condition them for them to be able to be conditioned reinforcers. And good grades. I myself, as well as my oldest, really get reinforced by good grades. And we know how it feels when we get them, and it's beneficial. When I was younger, I would maybe get a toy or some other sort of reinforcement as well for good grades. So good grades have become a conditioned reinforcer. All right, considerations. We do need to consider what type of reinforcement we're going to use, right? We want to make these conditioned reinforcers, but what do we want to have as reinforcement? We have to remember that it's individualized, right? So we know that not all reinforcers are created equal for each client. They're very unique to that individual, that person, and maybe we'll even do a preference assessment to find out what we should use as a reinforcer to condition a behavior. We also want to think about unwanted behaviors. So being careful about what we are reinforcing. If we don't reinforce quickly enough after the behavior, we can inadvertently reinforce an unwanted behavior. So for example, Mom sees her two kids playing really nicely together. She wants to catch them being good. She says, "Oh, Bobby and Sue, you guys are playing so well together. Let me go get you a treat." So she leaves, gets a treat, comes back. They're fighting and biting and scratching each other, blood everywhere. And she's like, "No, no, stop, stop." And then she gives them the treat and they stop fighting and then they eat their treat. But what is happening here is she could inadvertently be reinforcing that negative, challenging behavior instead of the behavior that she wanted to, which was the two kids getting along, right? And we also need to consider motivation. We can't just rely on those primary reinforcers alone. And remember, those primary reinforcers are those things like air, heat, food. We can't just rely on those. We're going to maybe need to up the ante for that reinforcer and maybe have something more tangible with it as well. So, G4, this one is use stimulus and response prompts and fading. So, what is a stimulus prompt? The Big White Bible would say it's a stimulus prompt involves manipulating antecedent stimuli in a way to cue a correct response in conjunction with the critical discriminant stimulus. And that's a mouthful. So, basically, stimulus prompts, they cue a correct response. And we want them to cue a correct response because we really want our learner to come in contact with reinforcement quickly. We want to set them up for success. There's a couple different types of stimulus prompts. So let's consider which one we should use, right? Do we want to use a movement cue, a redundancy cue, or a position cue? So when you think of movement cues, that might be gesturing, pointing, tapping, or glancing at the correct response. So say you have an array of items and you want the child to pick the apple, you might gesture towards the apple as an antecedent, right? It's the cueing. And then, or if we want to do a redundancy cue, we might alter physical dimension of the stimulus. So if you have a hot and cold tap, you might put a big red H on the hot and a big blue C on the cold. And that's altering a physical dimension of it. And it's going to help the learner possibly come into contact with that correct answer, right? If you say touch the hot, and then seeing that big red H might help cue them to touch the hot tap. We could also enlarge the correct stimulus or exaggerate the correct answer. Another thing we could consider using are position cues. So maybe manipulate where the correct answer is. Maybe place it closer to the learner, or maybe even get rid of distracting items. Now, some examples and non examples of these stimulus prompts. Start with the non, using physical guidance to attain the correct answer. So that would be maybe like taking their hand and touching the apple that you want them to touch because it's the correct answer. It is not keeping stimuli identical and it's not modeling the behavior. So you're not showing the client the behavior that you want them to do and them doing it. What it is, though, is placing correct stimulus closer to the learner. So maybe a position cue, right? Putting the correct answer closer to them when we're doing our trials. Maybe it's highlighting an aspect of the stimulus, such as making it larger. And maybe it's gesturing to the correct stimuli. Maybe it's those movement cues. Moving on to response prompts. Those operate directly under those response, meaning that no additional physical object needs to be manipulated during the prompt. Okay, so response prompts, unlike stimulus prompts, are when prompts are presented in addition to the instruction or cue to evoke the correct responding. So it's not that prior, which is the stimulus prompts, which are like embedded into those materials. This comes after, and the response prompt operates directly on the response. Well, considerations for this one. I immediately think of how intrusive do we want our response prompts to be, right? So, which ones are we going to use? Are we going to model the prompt, perform the target skill for the client, or maybe a verbal prompt? So, giving a verbal cue to the client to help them reach the correct conclusion, and even physical prompts. So, guiding the client to complete the skill or criteria. So, you'll be physically guiding them. And some examples and non examples of those response prompts are starting with the non, doing the task for the learner, right? You don't want to just simply do it for them. You're not giving them that opportunity to learn. It's not moving the correct item closer. It's a stimulus prompt, remember? And it's not pointing to the correct answer, which is also the stimulus prompt. But what it is a verbal prompt, such as maybe instructions to help them get the correct response. The modeling prompt is you're modeling the correct response that you want them to see, or maybe providing physical guidance prompts to complete the correct response. So that could be hand over hand, an example. Well, when we need to use these prompts, we have to have some consideration. So, what kind of prompts are we going to use? For stimulus or response prompts, like which ones? When should we start fading prompts? And so I'd like to say that the fading, I'll touch on that, we always want to think about fading right from the very beginning. And so that we can fade out any, say, tangible prompts, etc., and then be left with just that social reinforcing prompt. Okay, fading prompts. Fading is a procedure for transferring stimulus control in which features of an antecedent stimulus controlling a behavior are gradually changed to a new stimulus while maintaining the current behavior. Stimulus features can be faded in or they can be faded out. Okay. So for stimulus prompts, and so for fading stimulus prompts, we can use stimulus fading. And that involves highlighting a physical dimension of that stimulus to increase the likelihood of that response. We're going to gradually fade out that highlighted dimension. The dimension could be the color, the size, or maybe even the position of the stimuli. And then we also have stimulus shape transformations. So we might have, oh, all right, on to fading stimulus prompts. So there's two types. We have stimulus fading and stimulus shape transformations. So the stimulus fading, that's going to involve highlighting a physical dimension of that stimulus, and that's going to increase that likelihood of the correct response. But then we're going to gradually fade that highlighted aspect out. It could be the color, the position, the size, a lot of different ways. And then we're going to gradually fade that out. Another way we're going to fade out stimulus prompts is through the stimulus shape transformations. And so what that is having that stimulus shape that's already prompting a correct response and gradually changing its form while still maintaining that correct response. And I'll show you some examples. Okay, so stimulus fading. See how it's fading out. Girl's sad. You can still see the girl, less girl, no girl, but the word sad is still there, right? Ball, same thing. Cup, same thing. Even this with practicing writing. And we're going to slowly fade it out. So maybe they trace the A's up at the top, and then they trace the A's in the middle. And as they go down, it's faded and faded. And then they're more, getting what we want them to do, which is do the A on their own, right? We also have to fade response prompts too. So we've learned about this already in class, so I won't spend too much time on it, but we can do this through most to least to most, graduated guidance, and time delay. And I'll get into those now. Okay, this is our classic prompt hierarchy. We've got here most to least and most to least. So we have one going up and one going down. So you'll see here how full physical, that's your hand over hand, and that's going to be really your most intrusive. And then you're going to go down to partial, modeling, gesture, verbal, maybe some time delay there. For the time delay, you really want this fading to be like a constant time delay and a progressive time delay. And you're going to use that to transfer that stimulus control from a prompt to the natural stimulus by delaying the presentation of the prompt following the presentation of the natural stimulus, right? And then you're going to do this constantly, like I said. Constant time delay is when you keep your time delay consistent until responding occurs prior to the prompt. Or you could do progressive time delay, and that's when you gradually increase the time delay until responding occurs prior to the prompt. We also have graduated guidance. So it says here gradual removal of intrusive physical prompts. So from the big white text, it says that gradual guidance begins with the behavior analyst following the participant's movements closely with her hands but not touching the participant. The behavior analyst then increases the distance of her hands for the participant by gradually changing the location of the physical prompt. Well, let's get ready for quiz time, everybody. Here we go. Question number 1, multiple choice. Response prompts are verbal, modeling, and physical prompts. True or false? Number 2, response prompts can be A, physically guiding prompts, B, moving correct answer closer to child, C, highlighting an aspect of the target. Number 3, multiple choice questions. Stimulus prompts are A, embedded in the materials, B, prompts that cue a correct response, or C, both A and B. Some types of conditioned reinforcers are A, paycheck, money, tokens, B, paycheck, money, heat, shelter, or C, both A and B. Who comes to mind when you think of conditioned reinforcers? Is it A, Cooper, B, Pavlov, or C, Richard? True and false here, we can rely solely on primary reinforcement to reinforce others. A, true, or B, false. And that's everything I have for today, everybody. If you have any questions, direct them towards Bob.